Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. This is Father Tom Soroka, and I'm so glad that you're with us this evening. Our show is being live streamed right now at YouTube and Facebook, so you can just go very simply to the Ancient Faith Ministries pages there. You can watch live and join in the conversation during the live show. Just go to the comment box and give us your thoughts. Another great way to connect with us during the show or anytime is to send us a text message right from your phone to 412-206-5012. That's 412-206-5012. And I really do believe that you're going to want to ask some questions today or have some comments. However, this is a call-in show, so we would also love to hear from you. So give us a call anytime. 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Matushka Trudy is going to be answering the phone. She's doing the audio tonight. And Simon is taking care of our video feed. So let's get started. Well, tonight we are going to discuss a new book called Journey to Simplicity, The Life and Wisdom of Archimandrite Roman Braga. Now, our guest has compiled a tremendous work, both of the history and of the thought and the influence that Father Roman has had really on the American church, of course, in the Romanian church also, but I think America has really been the beneficiary of his suffering and his witness. And he was born in 1922 when there was a lot of upheaval in Europe. And he, you might say, in a way, was born at the right time because he was the person to, with, of course, many other Romanian Orthodox bishops, priests, and lay people, to suffer for the sake of Christ under communism. And there was a lot of political and religious upheaval that Father Roman had to experience. But of course, mostly we want to talk about his time in prison and how this purified him, how this suffering made him holy. I think in our Orthodox faith, we understand this very, very deeply. No church has suffered what our kinsmen in the faith have suffered for 2,000 years. So I'm not going to talk too much about Father Roman. I do want to say one personal thing here. It's very timely that we are talking about Father Roman. So in 2 weeks, I am going to the Holy Mountain, Mount Athos in Greece, to visit some of the monasteries there, and this will be my second trip. I'm going there to visit one of the men who converted at my parish and then became a monastic. He's at the Iveron Monastery. However, my first trip to the Holy Mountain was in 1988, and I went with none other than Father Roman Braga. Father Roman and I alone stayed at the Prodromu Monastery at the Holy Mountain, which was the Romanian monastery that had just reopened at that time. And he knew many of the monastics that were being sent from Romania to the Holy Mountain after communism had fallen in Romania in order to restore that skeet. Which, when we say skeet, you know, in America, it's usually a very small monastery. This was a huge place, but in fact, it was considered a skeet. So I'm thinking about Father Roman today. I'm asking for his intercessions on my second trip, and he made my first trip absolutely wonderful and a tremendous experience. So I would like to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Daniel Hinshaw, MD, who is Professor Emeritus of Surgery and is consultant in palliative medicine at the University of Michigan. He's taught palliative care to medical professionals and clergy in multiple international settings. And in addition to many scientific articles and chapters, he is the author of several Orthodox books, and they are all outstanding. Suffering and the Nature of Healing, Touch and the Healing of the World, Thriving in the Face of Morality, and his latest book, just published by St. Vladimir Seminary Press, is Journey to Simplicity, the Life and Wisdom of Archimandrite Roman Braga. And what's significant about this is that Dr. Hinshaw gave Father Roman his course of medical treatments during his final illness, and he was there when he reposed in 2015. Dr. Daniel Hinshaw, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thank you, Father Tom, for your very kind introduction and for sharing the account about your trip to Mount Athos with Father Roman. I feel bad that I didn't have a chance to interview you about it while I was preparing the book. I know that a lot of stories are going to come out that I missed.
I think so. I think it'll be volume 2.
Yeah.
I think there are going to be a lot of stories that you are going to engender from your book.
Yeah. Well, I hope to hear more of them and hopefully stimulate them to come to the surface. There's so many people have been blessed by his life.
Yeah, and as I said, I really believe this, that he is somehow, to put it in a very pedestrian way, he's kind of fallen through the cracks, because I think that somehow his witness was so quiet, and he was not a man of a loud voice. He was not one that was boisterous in any way. He was extremely quiet and extremely humble and very simple. And he, of course, was the spiritual foundation in terms of clerical work of the Monastery of the Transfiguration in Elwood City. I mean, he really carried it through to then he moved to Michigan with his sister. So, Dr. Daniel, tell us what led you to write this book. Obviously, you have this connection with him in giving him medical care, but you see a lot of people that are dying, and why this book? Why him?
Well, to be very straightforward about it, Mother Gabriella, the abbess of the Holy Dormition Monastery in Rives Junction, Michigan, where Father Roman spent so much of the last years of his life, asked me to write it with a lot of collaboration with my wife, who was a very good editor, and we made it our COVID project, really. But
oh, wow.
We took about a year to actually assemble most of the materials and write it, and she had Mother Gabrielle had asked, I think, one or two other people to write it, and they weren't comfortable doing it. And then
right.
Because I had written some other materials that they were familiar with, and the book that you mentioned about touch, that was something that Father Roman blessed, that kind of project, which was a collaboration actually with one of the nuns who did the iconography in the book from our monastery here in Michigan.
And by the way, that's a very unique book. It is really a tremendous book that you wrote, and I'd love for you to come back sometime and we could talk about that book. But it really is, it's quite unique and beautiful.
Thank you. But anyway, I think it was partly because of that relationship, and then oddly enough, I'd written a book of fiction too, about American history actually, but a historical fiction, and the people at the monastery, I think, were familiar with it. I could apparently tell a reasonably good story, and part of the challenge of telling Father Roman's life was to try to put it into context. And so I've been an avid student of history, and the amazing kind of miraculous thing was that Father Roman, as you mentioned, was a very humble man, but he was also a very well-trained intellectual, and he kind of hid that.
Yes.
was always a constant kind of tension between his early education as an intellectual. I know you're going to ask about the Burning Bush movement a little bit later. Mm-hmm. Between that and between the relationship he had from a very early age with the monastics in his hometown of Kondrița in what was Bessarabia at the time, now the Republic of Moldova, where they basically, the parish church was the monastery church. And so there were the simple monks and the intellectuals that he experienced during his up and through his university education and a 1 year of graduate studies toward a PhD under Father Dimitri Staniloae before he was arrested the first time. There was this tension between, which direction should I go? And I would say the simple monks won out. And so anyway, in terms of my own involvement with his story, I think it may be that I see somehow a relationship between him as a spiritual father and mentor, being a physician, where I did a lot of my career was sort of academically oriented and so on, but it's always been the struggle to try to get back to the basic interaction with Christ in the person who's suffering in front of me. And Father Roman had insights into that I've been blessed as a physician to experience a lot of those encounters, but Father Roman had those encounters at levels that are just they really truly are ineffable. Particularly coming out of his prison time and
right
later.
So we haven't talked about his life, and I do want you to give a little bit of an overview about, kind of an elevator speech of his life. But before we do that, speak to our audience and to those who will be listening to this podcast. Why would Father Roman be relevant to us today? What is it about his witness? Obviously, this is going to sound ridiculous, but just to kind of set this up, I mean, we have tens of thousands of confessors of the faith, confessors meaning those who have suffered for the faith. But there are sort of political movements today, and there's shifting sands of politics. Why is Father Roman so very relevant for our particular time?
I think his life embodies, if you look at the whole period of his growing up years in the interwar Romania, and then the encounter with the communism after the Red Army occupied Romania, he lived and experienced all of these sort of polarities that we're now experiencing again. And I'll give you a quote from Father Roman that speaks to this. Now, this was in the context of a hyper-nationalistic monastery that sort of sought a conflict with the communist leadership at the time, and the people, I think, at the monastery were very devout. But anyway, Father Roman visited the monastery as a hierodeacon in the mid-1950s, and so did several other prominent figures, including Father Cleopa and others, and were concerned about this. And this is, I want to share that, and then I want to share something from his Securitate file, which is also very telling.
Wow.
So this first quote, though, is him reflecting on this time in the mid-1950s, between his two imprisonments. I have always feared the temptation of the Antichrist hidden in an uncontrolled nationalism. I never cared for the idea that we are better than other nations in the world, and we are privileged and favored by God in a special way, or we Romanians have a special role those other nations do not have, and the salvation of the world will come from us. All these exaltations kill every trace of spirituality. This idea is a diabolical trap. And of course, you could just put America in there instead of Romania. I mean, wow. This is the problem. And then the
or a few other
quote,
countries too.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, it's this is the or orthodoxy in the modern era is centered around nation states, and this is part of the dilemma that the Orthodox Church faces. So the second quote is actually from an interrogation that Father Roman had about a similar time of this other issue. And when the interrogators, of course, had spies in the prisons, and so during his first imprisonment, toward the end of it, after he'd been at Pitești, he met Ernest Bernea, who was a very famous right-wing intellectual. Most of the intellectuals in Romania in the interwar years between World War I and World War II were right-wing. That's not true in the France and Germany and so forth. Up until Hitler, it was mostly left-wing. But in Eastern Europe, especially Romania, there were some very fine thinkers, but they had a very strong kind of right-wing bent. And very highly nationalistic. And so Ernest Bernea was one of these figures, and they were talking about one of his books in prison, and the informer had in the prison, they had informers in prison, had made a note of this, and the interrogators, after he was released from prison, okay, what were you guys talking about? And this is what he had to say about Bernea, who had authored this particular book. He said, quote, "He confirmed to me that between Christian morality and political activity, there are these contradictions that cannot be eliminated. Thus, you either lead a Christian life that is in conformity with the principles of Christian morality, or you engage in political activity. Those were nothing more than the conclusions that I had personally reached." So his conclusion was that Christian politics was not possible. And I think that is extremely relevant for us today. On either end of the spectrum, I'm just,
absolutely. Absolutely. And that would also be a worthy discussion, because I have given several sermons now to speak about the danger of, elevating politics to the level of faith and religion. Politics certainly has its place, but the Lord Jesus Christ said very clearly, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. And he's not equating the two. And so I think Father Roman's words are very timely for us to remember that we will not be saved in this earthly kingdom or by this earthly kingdom. There are certainly things that are worth fighting for, and there are things that are worth, standing up for in our society, but we cannot lose the sight of what is truly important. So let's remind our viewers, 1-855-AF-radio. Maybe you remember Father Roman, either in Michigan or in Elwood City, Pennsylvania. We would love to hear from you if you have any reminiscing that you'd like to do. If you have any questions for Dr. Hinshaw, we would love to hear from you. Also, you can send us a text message at 412-206-5012. By the way, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, you will see a picture of Father Roman behind Dr. Hinshaw's left shoulder. And he was a really beautiful man. He had a very, very peaceful face, always a very, very peaceful face. And, no matter what the situation was, because his life was no easier here in terms of creature comforts. They came here with nothing and built two magnificent monasteries. And it was really due to his prayers and the prayers of his family, of Princess Yelena, whose mother Alexandra, and did amazing work. Dr. Hinshaw, if you would please give us a very short, if you can, outline for those who don't know who Father Roman is. How would you explain to them? I know he has obviously a very long story, but in short, how would you explain to someone who knows nothing of him when he lived, the political and religious atmosphere in which he was brought up, and the time in which he lived in terms of the war, the geopolitics, because that's a very important part of his story, right? Like he is born right after World War I, and then he is caught up, not caught up, but he's trapped in these political movements that are happening in Romania, and then of course communism comes in after World War II. So give us a little taste of his life, if you would, please.
Well, he was just amazing. He was sort of like every place it turns out with the research that he knew just about every major figure in Romanian culture and politics, because he either met them in prison or was connected to them through his intellectual life in his early formation. And he was a simple peasant. I mean, the family took pride in the fact that they had never been serfs. They were small, had like a small herd of cattle in this kind of remote village south of Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova now. But at that time, that was for a brief period of time after World War I, there was a thing called Greater Romania, which included now the Republic of Moldova, and the different elements that make up Romania, but now Moldova is separated. And so he grew up identifying, very strongly with this sort of Romanian identity. There were a number of threads from the 19th century that were very nationalistic, but also sort of Romania's backward. We need to Westernize it to some extent, but we're gonna make it purify it of foreigners. And on the list, of course, were the Roma, Jewish people, and some of this was very strong anti-Semitism in the environment around them. And various
explain
movements.
who the Roma are. Some people don't know that.
Yeah, so the Roma is the preferred name for what you probably may be familiar with, gypsies. But the reason they're called Roma is because they came from Rome, from Eastern. They migrated out of India. They were probably low caste Indians, maybe even untouchables. They migrated west and ended up in Byzantium sometime maybe around the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And they kept migrating. They kept preserving a lot of their own beliefs while also being somewhat syncretistic. They took on other beliefs as they went. So I've met Roma because I've done hospice work in Romania, who were Orthodox, but they also still retain some of this, what's the right word? Some of the kind of Indian belief in transmigration of souls and so on.
Right. Yeah, like a folk religion.
Yeah, and Judaism has never, the Jewish people have never been assimilated. So this was something that in these nation states, especially new ones like Romania, they really resisted. Well, why aren't you assimilating? It wasn't the kind of obsession with eugenics that the Nazis had, but they would have been happy if Jewish people had just become Orthodox, I think. I don't think they were obsessing so much about racial purity as sort of cultural purity, and there were elements of this that became fairly violent early on in the 1920s. One element that was probably very charismatic was founded by an individual named Cornel Codreanu, which became the Legion of the Order of Saint Michael the Archangel. And if you read he wrote a manifesto, kind of like Hitler's Mein Kampf, where it's entitled "For My Legionaries," and he talked about a lot of good things. I mean, but he introduced sort of an emphasis on family life, on solidarity in the rural areas, especially. Had a lot of summer camps, a lot of programs that helped economically depressed areas. But at the same time, he also elevated St. Michael to the sort of he kind of pushed the Theotokos to the side, and St. Michael took on this sort of vengeful warrior image to purify the nation. And then if you read the For My Legionaries, it's openly anti-Semitic, and then unfortunately he was involved in some assassinations of prime ministers, but he was later killed. The older brother of Princess Ileana, who was sort of supposed to be the regent over King Michael, the last king of Romania, he was very much hated by the legionaries and others in the country because he had a Jewish mistress. And he eventually took control of the government in the late 1930s and arrested Cornel Codriano and some of his colleagues and had them murdered. So they in some sense became kind of martyrs. And so there's a significant loyalty to that following, in the country to this day. He's a complex figure, very controversial.
Does the movement still exist?
There are various attempts to kind of recapitulate some aspects of it on the right, on the political right, I think, in Romania.
I see. It's interesting because I think in that time, in various Orthodox countries, there arose, it wasn't just in Romania, it was in Russia and Greece, where you had these pseudo-church religious / political organizations that I think at the root of them, they, to a certain extent, they meant well. They wanted people to deepen their faith and understand, and it wanted it to be a kind of unifying way, but also it kind of morphed into a political movement. And as you said, in this particular case, certainly to oust Jewish people from Romania.
Right, and I think that it's important to note, just briefly, that this was one of many movements. There was another movement called the Washta Domnule, which was like the Lord's Army, and it was founded by a priest who actually was the uncle of Archbishop Valerian, who has his own complicated history here in the United States. Trifa, yeah, and it was, but Joseph Trifa, Father Joseph Trifa, saw that there were a lot of Protestant missions in Transylvania, especially where he was living, and he developed a whole program of Bible study and Reformation among the Orthodox peasants. He said, "Well, you need to know your Bible. We need to," and so he kind of to inoculate them a little bit against kind of the evangelical church, and eventually his program was co-opted by a legionary bishop, who then, for whatever reason, it's not clear, I don't know all the history of this, but for some reason defrocked the poor father and then moved the movement more in a political direction, because the uncle, Father Joseph Trifa, was apolitical. It was all about kind of a spiritual renewal.
Okay, so we're talking about the political movements within Romania, religious movements within Romania after the time of World War I, what we know as the World War I. In your book, it's called the Great War, right? And at what point does Father Roman's story enter into this particular time, and how is then he formed religiously?
Well, as a little boy, his major formation was from his mother, who later died a schema nun, Maria Braga. She was tonsured as Maria Magdalena late in life. But her husband she had always wanted to be a nun, but she obeyed her parents and got married, and the husband was very supportive of her spiritual life, and he worked in a bread factory in Chisinau during the week. And so most of the time, the two youngest members of the household were Versavia, which became Mother Benedicta, his sister, who was here in the United States with him later, and who went to Varatek Monastery as a very young, like a young age, 10 to 12 years of age, stayed with a maternal aunt and was formed there and educated there, and then later had university education, partly to protect her from being showing that she could be useful as an educator to the communist government later. But the amazing thing was that Maria Braga incorporated this sort of spirituality into the house, so that if they were naughty, they read a kathisma from the Psalter, and he was chanting from they put him up on a stand to chant in the monastery. The monks loved him. At age 5, he was kind of tiny, and they had him chanting, and he could read the Romanian in the Cyrillic alphabet. So he knew the Cyrillic alphabet before he knew the actual modern Romanian alphabet. Yeah, it's kind of funny. And there was one point where apparently his mother, he was kind of getting tired, and they said, well, his mother told him, he said, well, we have to be patient in church, because this is all we can offer to God is our fatigue. And he remembered these things. Of course, this applied later, significantly to his living in the solitary confinement, but his spiritual formation was sort of in this not pseudo, but semi-monastic kind of life at home. And everything was embraced. I mean, the monk priest from the monastery would come out and bless their cattle in their barn. They would have and bless the seeds that they sowed in their field. I mean, this was this whole sense of orthodoxy in the entire environment of what he lived. And then when he went to ecclesiastical high school near Bucharest, in the Cernica Monastery, which was a place where the Hesychast tradition had been introduced into Romania in the 18th and 19th century by Saint Kalanick, he witnessed a number of very simple monks who were just, they just did their obediences. They were constantly praying silently the Jesus prayer, and later, when he had gotten involved in this intellectual movement in Bucharest as a university student called the Burning Bush movement, he would come back and visit Cernica, and they would say, "Lectures about this? You have lectures about the Jesus prayer?" I mean, we just pray it.
Just do it.
Yeah, just do it. So this is the challenge is knowing a lot about God versus knowing God.
And by the way, I just wanted to bring up for our listeners, because again, I'm hoping that we have English-speaking listeners from all over the world. I know we do, and we have Romanian listeners. However, for our American listeners, when Dr. Hinshaw talks about these Romanian monasteries, these are not small monasteries. Yeah. These monasteries have thousands and thousands of monks in them. Even at that particular time, they were thriving, and they are actually, again, thriving today, especially some of these ones outside of Bucharest. They are very, very famous monasteries and very large. We had Father Paul Janakos on here to talk about his trip to Romania, and it was just astounding. What I hear from the story of Father Roman is the family, of course, was deeply immersed in this Romanian Orthodox culture, right? Which was imbued throughout their entire existence. It was morning, noon, and night. It was the meals. It was how they farmed. It was how they taught their children, right? I think that sense for us as modern Americans is very difficult to grasp, as well as the idea that when he went to these monasteries, there wasn't 20 monks there. There were thousands. So it's important for us to remember that. 1-855-AF-RADIO, that's 1-855-237-2346. Send a text message to 412-206-5012. And for those of you that are on Facebook and YouTube, we'd love to take your questions or comments. So I know there's some chat going on there. on YouTube. But if you have any questions for Dr. Hinshaw, let us know. All right, so Dr. Daniel, at this point, he is being raised in a way, affected by these large monasteries. At what point does he actually enter into this life?
Well, that's a really important point because that takes him into the prisons. So he knew, at some level, he knew that his mother had always hoped that he would become a priest, at least, and possibly a married priest. But he sensed that she really hoped that he would become a monastic. But he didn't feel a strong certainty about becoming a monastic until he actually met one of these simple monks again, Father Yevgeny Hulea, when he was in the last year or so of his first sentence. So after Pitești, where they tried to create a communist personality through torture, he was sent to the peninsula, and the fond epithet that Anna Pauker and Gheorghiu Dej, the two communist leaders of Romania at the time, gave the Danube Delta, they were going to build this canal. It was like a Stalinist project to connect the Danube to the Black Sea. They called it the graveyard of the bourgeoisie. And it was certainly that. I mean, they killed a lot of Romanians. And anyway, that he was there sort of recovering. I mean, he was still at least no longer in the Pitești experiment, but he met this priest who had he said he's very simple. He had never had a full high school education even. He had been formed in the monastery, but he had memorized the entire ladder of divine ascent. And when he was able, he would share this with all of the prisoners who wanted to hear it. And there were many Roman Catholic and Eastern Rite Catholics who weren't familiar with it, who were just captivated by it. And they would come, and it was, and the poor man, they would make him work. Most of them had Sunday off out of the labor gangs, but not the priests. They would make them work on Sunday morning to make sure that they couldn't serve liturgy on Sundays. And so when Father Yevgeny came back from his harsh labor, he would still have time to share, this. And he saw, Father Roman said, he saw in me, I'm sort of paraphrasing it, he saw in me some intellectual errors, and he wanted to kind of cure me of that. And then he told Father Roman, he said, you're called to be a monk. When you get out of prison, you come to my skete, and we pray, we say the Paraclesis, and we're being saved. So it's this sort of the whole round of the monastic life. We do our obediences, and we're being saved, and that plus a very powerful dream that Father Roman had. Those were the two things that convinced him that he needed to become a monastic.
I hate to go back, but because I think it's important. It almost goes to what we were talking about at the beginning, like what are the lessons that are important for us as contemporaries? And you were talking about the political polarization and these sort of nationalistic movements. Go back and tell us a little bit about Pitești, because this is his first prison experience, right? This is the first sentence. Tell us a little bit about what Pitești was, what the purpose of it was. Because it's not just, they throw you in a cell and just don't talk to you. There's a purpose that the communist government at this time, Romania is communist, right? Reporting to Moscow at that point. And he's sentenced to Pitești. And what type of prison is this, and why was he sentenced? What was his crime?
So Well, there were several things that they accused him of, but the wastebasket term for young intellectuals was you're a legionary. So he had one of his best friends was a member of one of the student brotherhoods, but they were all way too young to be in the formal legionary movement where they were doing political violence and so on. These were all the youth organizations, and by the late 1940s, when the communist government finally clamped down on everybody in 1948, they shut down the Burning Bush movement and so on. They started arresting young intellectuals, basically from about age 20 to 35. They figured that they had all arrested in a place in the north called Seagate prison. They arrested all of the senior intellectuals, all of the former political figures, the former prime ministers, and so on. Almost all of them died in prison. They arrested all of the Eastern Rite Catholic bishops, and almost every one of them died in prison. They wanted to make sure that the papacy had almost no influence in Romania. They thought we can control the Orthodox Church, but we're not going to let this foreign power be involved. But they thought, because of the work of Ivan Pavlov, in the conditioned reflex, and also by an educator named Makarenko, they thought they could create a communist new man. So they're borrowing from St. Paul's language, the new man in Christ, but they're going to create a new man through conditioning, and it would be harsh, brutal torture. And so they took everything that was sacred, everything, and perverted it. So they were forcing these prisoners. They first of all they got them acclimatized to they would train a group to be torturers and promise them, we'll give you better treatment and so on. Then they would mix them with the victims and get them to share, their intimate secrets and so forth with them, and then turn on them and beat them senseless, and then turn them into torturers. And the basic message of the Pitești phenomenon, because that's what eventually is called, it affected the whole country, the idea was to compromise everyone. Everybody should be, I think Father Roman said, a dutiful dog that would bark when it was supposed to do because it wanted to get fed. And of course, the barking was basically informing on your neighbor. And a very good Stalinist. Oh, it was awful. Yeah. And so this, and even Father Roman told me once, earlier, before I knew I was going to be writing the book, about he had some nephews who from one of his older siblings who had been going to school, and they had to lie because the teachers were grilling them. Okay, are you praying at home? And so to have a real prayer life, you had to lie. And this is what the whole church was structured around, lies, because if you had any kind of internal life, you had to lie. And then the whole sheer weight of the securitate, the security people, with their whole network of informers and so forth, eventually kind of collapsed, because a lot of even some of the securitate agents were secret Christians. And in fact, that's how Mother Benedicta, I don't have time to tell the story, but that's how she and the future Mother Gabriela got out of Romania, was because her spiritual son was also the Securitate handler that she had at Varatek. This is an amazing story.
Wow.
So there are a lot of kind of miraculous elements to the whole story of their lives.
Like St. Paul converting his guards,
Yeah. No, and even when he had some torturers, he overheard, because this was when his first imprisonment, they were talking about, this is how he found out that the next day was going to be Pascha. And these are people who had brutally beaten him to a pulp, and they said, well, what are you doing tomorrow? Well, it's my Pascha. And Father Roman was very forgiving. He said, well, so God is speaking to even my torturers. They can't quite get rid of God. I don't know what they
Right.
were going to do on Pascha, but it was clearly still ingrained into them that this this most important of all Christian holidays was still part of their being on some level. It was an extraordinary, but yeah, I mean, this is where he learned how to actually do the Jesus prayer. He was in solitary confinement before the Pitești re-education was their euphemism for the torture.
Re-education camp, right.
The re-education, before it began, Father Roman had been in solitary confinement for many months. And that's when he really began to discover the inner universe. And because of that, he and some others, I don't think they were kind of failures. They didn't really get fully trained to be re-educators themselves. And so then he was sent to the peninsula, to, I guess, basically be worked to death, except that I think they were saved basically because of the death of Stalin, that first imprisonment.
That one story that you talk about with, he's talking about what are you going to do for Pascha? Reminds me of that story, and the name of the bishop in Russia escapes me, but it was during the earlier days of communism, and they brought this bishop before. It was a big show trial, and the first thing that happened, the judge got very angry because when the bishop walked in, everybody stood up like naturally, and he told them all to sit down. And then as the story goes, and forgive me, I'm sure one of our listeners will tell us who it was, the prosecutor said to him, well, if you say God exists and you say the Russian people believe in him, he says, you should prove it. And the bishop said, Christos voskres, Christ is risen. And everybody in the place said, Voistinu voskres, indeed he is risen, And it's like, you can't get it out of their blood, it's a part of them, no matter how much the communists tried to, erase the memory of the church among the people.
And that's the naivete of that, because Pavlov himself had documented that the conditioning that they were trying to do, it would extinguish with time. I mean, you'd have to keep reinforcing it. And they sure tried. Right. I mean, but it eventually, most of the people recovered. About 40 people that Father Roman knew were driven insane, and they ended up in, quote, psychiatric hospitals.
There is, before we talk about his and his family moving to the United States, and Sam Cook says, I think I remember reading a story similar to this in the Gulag Archipelago. That's Solzhenitsyn, the bishop being identified as Patriarch Tikhon. All right, Saint Tikhon. Thank you, Sam. All right. So we have a question from Stefan, and it says, was Father Braga the priest who met Dr. Wormbrand in the hospital and possibly convinced Dr. Wormbrand and his wife to convert to Orthodoxy? I'm referring to Dr. Wormbrand, the Protestant evangelist from Romania. He was a Jew, as was his wife. He converted to Christianity, but during his illness in America, he met a Romanian priest. Are you familiar with this at all?
I am, but Father Roman, I don't think was the priest. So my understanding is that on his deathbed, Pastor Wormbrand asked for two Orthodox priests came and quietly chrismated him.
What?
That's my understanding, that he died as an Orthodox. Now, Wormbrand,
I have no idea.
The story goes that Valerio Gafencu, if people are familiar, I'm sure a lot of the listeners are familiar with the story of the Saint of the Prisons. But Valerio Gafencu was one of a little bit older member of the Iron Guard. He completely repented of the political aspect of it and became a living saint. And at least one version of the story is that he was given streptomycin. It was sent to the prison. He was in basically Ward 4, which was the ward where people died at this particular prison, Târgu Ocna. And so was Wormbrand. But he gave, at least one account is that he gave Wormbrand his streptomycin. He said, you need to go, you'll live. and you need to tell the world what's going on here, which he did, which Wurmbrand did. But interestingly enough, there's a letter, if you read in the appendix of the book about Father Roman, The Journey to Simplicity, okay. There's an open letter that Father Roman wrote shortly after he arrived in Brazil to a Romanian language newspaper here in North America, I think called The Journey, Drum. And it's quite extraordinary. He's writing to Wurmbrand. I don't know if Wurmbrand ever responded to him, but basically saying, I remember. But he also said, sort of in the kind of plural, he and several of the theological students at Bucharest went to the Jewish ghetto in Bucharest to see the mission that Wurmbrand had as a Lutheran pastor to the Jewish community there, trying to convert them to Christianity in the early 1940s. And so Father Roman may have been just finishing up his actual ecclesiastical high school, what they call seminary there. I'm not sure he was at the university yet, but they were very interested in what this Jewish man was doing. And so he knew him, and he actually had invited Wurmbrand to meetings of the Burning Bush. So Wurmbrand at least went once to the Burning Bush meetings, apparently at St. Antime Monastery. So Wurmbrand had been introduced to orthodoxy in various ways, and that seed was growing in him. So I'm not surprised that maybe on his deathbed he would quietly become Orthodox. But it may be an apocryphal story. But Father Roman, I don't think, was not one of the priests that went to his deathbed. But he certainly had a great respect for Wurmbrand and knew him personally at one point.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea that that was even out there. I would love to sort of track that down. I'm sure that it would be denied in many circles, but
right.
I'd love to get to the heart of that.
It would be like Yaroslav Pelikan becoming an Orthodox at the end of his life, and he, great Lutheran scholar.
Thank God that he was very public. He was very public about it. Yeah. All right. So we're coming to the end of our program, Dr. Hinshaw. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This was really very, very enlightening. And we do want to remind everybody, you can go to svspress.com. And I think it's on all the major bookstores online and so forth. And purchase this outstanding book, because we need, and as Dr. Hinshaw said, this is not just a historical tale. There are many parallels to our day that we need to see and understand, or at least that it seems to be leaning in that way. So look for Journey to Simplicity, the Life and Wisdom of Archimandrite Roman Braga. So in our final minutes, Dr. Hinshaw, could we talk a little bit about, you just alluded to, he left Romania. So first of all, why did he leave Romania? How did he leave Romania? And what route took him to North America and to the United States?
Well, to sort of summarize it quickly, he had been ordained a priest after he was released from prison the second time, which was during the general amnesty in 1964. By about 1965, he was ordained. He served in some very remote parishes in the far north of Romania, and he scandalized the local Communist Party because he created a youth choir from all of the Communist Party members' children. And then in the middle of the night, they came and sent him to an even more remote town. And finally, Patriarch Justinian, who has been maligned, I think, in a lot of ways. Father Roman was very protective of him, actually, because he did keep the churches open, but he made compromises. He was called the Red Patriarch derisively by some. But the Patriarch Justinian tonsured him an Archimandrite and then promptly sent him to Brazil. But again, no one can leave communist Romania at that time, essentially, without a mission. And that because the interior ministry ran the church. And so there was a hieromonk from Romania who was living out in the jungle somewhere in Brazil and had allegedly, quotes, gone rogue. I don't know the full details of it, but Father Roman was given the task of going to Brazil and looking for this guy and then reporting back to the Patriarchal Church about what had happened to him. Well, by the time he got to him, he had just died. And then at that point, Father Roman had a year visa and would have been expected to go back to Romania, and he did not want to go back to Romania. And so he appealed to the Antiochian patriarchal archbishop who was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, for sanctuary. And he gave him, protected him. And so he was actually under the Antiochian Patriarchate, which was very smart for Father Roman, because there were good relationships between the communist patriarchal church in Romania at the time and this historic patriarchate in the Middle East. And so they couldn't really get at him, even though they wanted to drag him back. So he and the good, kind-hearted metropolitan in Sao Paulo sponsored him, and he got a Brazilian passport, and so he was safe. And he spent 4 years there, and then eventually moved to the North American, scene that we're familiar with, and spent the rest of his life here. So his life was pretty much split almost equally between East and Western hemispheres.
Yeah, it's really, I think, a great blessing for our land that he and his sister and then all these other Romanian nuns and monks came to this land to help us deepen our understanding and life in the Orthodox faith. There's an article that came out just a few months ago. It's in July, and it said that the Romanian Synod canonizes 16 martyrs, confessors, and ascetics of the 20th century. Now, of course, Father Roman is not numbered among them because he was a member of the Orthodox Church in America. However, there are obviously very amazing names in here. Father Dumitru Staniloi, who, of course, was also, I think you said, a teacher of Father Roman. Archimandrite Cleopa, right? Very, very famous, and on and on. So they plan on next year, which is the 140th anniversary of the Romanian Orthodox Autocephaly and the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Romanian Patriarchate, to number among the saints these 16 martyrs and confessors. So glory to God for that. Any last words, Dr. Hinshaw, before we close this evening?
Well, I'll try to say them quickly because, first of all, I want to make sure the listeners know that the royalties for the book go to the monastery here in Rives Junction. I'm not...
Thank you very much for
I want to make sure and then of course the book is also obviously supporting St. Vladimir Seminary, who is publishing it. But I wanted to quote a prayer that Father Roman had for America, and this was something that he was so discerning, and this was like 50 years ago that he saw this. He was a very strong advocate for the unity of Orthodoxy in this country, even 50 years ago. But I wanted to read this prayer for the listeners because I think it's just a beautiful statement. He recognized that Orthodox spirituality in the West would have to be different because we come to the Orthodox Church largely, converts come to it as intellectuals. We're trying to find the true church, the historical church, and so on. And it's not something that comes up through the soil like it's been through centuries of Orthodoxy in the old country. And here's the quote. Lord, we pray especially that among these children who are intelligent and athletic, yet at the same time gullible and naive, some mystics or fools for Christ will someday emerge, those who will shatter all of Satan's temples, opening wide the gates of the hearts of all men to an encounter with Jesus Christ. Because in this century of material overindulgence, America needs more fasting and prayer. She needs genuine saints who could revolutionize the entire universe toward new dimensions. And I think that could apply to the 21st century as well.
Indeed. Amen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Dr. Daniel Hinshaw, thank you so much. Again, we want to remind everybody, Journey to Simplicity, the life and wisdom of Archimandrite Roman Braga. All of your books are really fascinating, from even, Money and Salvation, which seems like, that it's a small book, but it's such a beautiful book. I mean, it's a real page turner. I love that book. And there's just so many beautiful things that you write. And I'm absolutely thrilled about this particular book. I hope that everyone is deeply affected by it as much as I was. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Before we share some final thoughts, I do want to offer my sincere thanks to Dr. Hinshaw for joining us tonight. Thanks to Matuszka Trudy. Thanks to Simon. Thanks to Melissa Graff. And for everybody that's listening in, and for those who will be listening. I did want to read just one quick quote from the book. After Father Roman was released from prison, he talks about communism. And, Dr. Hinshaw and I were talking at the beginning of the program about, it's sort of like what is old is new again. And every generation, we have to be reminded that communism sounds like a wonderful ideal, but it has never produced anything but death and destruction. Never in the history of the world. And so Father Roman actually speaks or writes about communism. He says, the communists are capable of anything. Sometimes they came at night and took some of us, and even to this day, we do not know what happened to these people. Only recently have the common graves been discovered, because man, as a person for them, did not mean anything. They used to take every fourth man, and he would disappear. Communism is an idea. And for this abstract idea, they killed the real thing, people. This is very interesting because they say that communism brings happiness to people, but they killed people for this idea. They are not realistic, but idealistic. To me, we Christians are more realistic than they are. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Ancient Faith Today. Share out our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. And by the way, Dr. Hinshaw is going to be going to Canonsburg on September 7th, I think it is. Is that correct? Something like that. I'll post it. September 10th. All right. Go to Canonsburg. See Dr. Hinshaw. Good night, everybody.